Hello. Today I'm going to be going over the book, The Politics of Military Rule in Brazil from 1964 to 1985 by Thomas E. Skidmore. This book was written in the late 80s, and even though it's a book that's decades old, it's still seen as a book that allows for a pretty extensive understanding and dive into what happened in those 21 years. And it's still seen as a book that can be trusted to provide information on that military dictatorship and coup. And we're going to be diving into the 8 chapters today and a pretty brief overview. One of the things that's most impressive is starting right off that Skidmore doesn't just go straight into the 1964 coup. He talks about President Vargas and 2 coups that had taken place before. He talks about a coup in 1945 and a coup in 1954. And the first one was essentially to take Vargas out of power because he had been ruling too long and the military didn't trust him. But they didn't institute full control. They instituted a minor one. They allowed still elections to take place and new leaders to be elected. So Vargas was able to actually come back to power. But after continued economic issues, after his men tried to kill his political opponents, he was faced with suicide. And in 1954, the military instituted another coup. But in 1955 and 1960, democratic elections continued and democracy was stable. What had happened was that in 1961, President Quadros didn't get his way with Congress, essentially, and he was trying to play a game of bluff and resigned. Next in line was João Goulart, who is pictured, and he was seen as a politician on the left. And the military, before they instituted the coup in 1964, they tried to restrict his power in many different ways, including in rules and acts that would just limit the power of the presidency. But that was rejected in 1963 by the voters. Essentially, what had happened is by 1964, his popularity began to wane. He had little congressional support, bad economic situations, and a country that he could not control. He was trying to get more power to even stop protesters, and everything that was continuing to happen set off alarms within the military, and they instituted a military coup. The only difference is that they wouldn't return power shortly thereafter. This one, they would have power for 21 years. And the military got to work very quickly on doing 2 different things. 1, installing a leader that the military fully supported. And 2, creating economic recovery so that the military could win an election in just a few years. Castelo Branco was chosen as the next president, and he's photoed right there. He was an anti-Goulart military man who was trained by the Americans. And his goal was to basically ban anyone he saw as a threat to the new military power. This was communists, moderates, and even politicians such as former President Kubitschek, who was well respected as a senator at the time. The new government was trying to stop inflation that was increasing at 100% a year. They were trying to decrease spending, have less state spending, working to weaken unions and collective bargaining. And they were trying to make it so that they could get back to having a stronger economy and a democratic union, although that democratic union, in their hope, would elect the military time and time again. Chapter 3 talks about the end of Castello's term in March of 1967. It covers his implementation of the Second Institutional Act, which essentially allowed for the president, vice president, and governors to be elected indirectly, as well as for any person of elected office to be banned from holding office if the president saw fit. Even with little support in Congress, he was able to push this through as a presidential declaration. And he also made it where generals could not stay in power for life. So trying to not have generals consolidate all of this different power that could then undermine the military dictatorship by splintering. And also making it so that people that he disagreed with couldn't hold power, people who disagreed with the military coup. And their promise of having an election soon thereafter started to slowly disappear because they were trying to make it so that their people, their military supporters or the people in the military, could hold on to office. His war minister, Costa Silva, was seen as the next president of Brazil, and they thought this is because he could unify the armed forces. And he actually, when Silva took over, inherited a good economy with a possibility for foreign investment. But one of the most important things to notice is how they were trying to play to the military. Because even though they were having people lead in sort of a civilian sense, They still wanted people who could play to the military because the military was still in charge. That's why they didn't want generals around forever, because they didn't want different generals gaining so much power that no progress or nothing could be done without their consent. Castello did give the military greater control, though, and did put greater censorship on the media. We start to see democracy quickly dying off here, with the military really being the ones in power. Even if they're trying to restrict the power, they still had a lot of it. Chapter 4 dives into the presidency of Costa Silva, seen here with his cabinet, and it starts right in 1967 with his inauguration. The chapter ends with his stroke and successors. It talks about President Castillo left Silva with a better economy than he found it. But sometimes when you're trying to fix the problems, it only leads to worse, and Silva flipped the nation's economic policies on its head. His government decided not to be involved with social or moral issues that governments usually involve themselves with, and they didn't really have a strong social net. His government was also starting to deal with protesters, guerrilla fighters, and subversives. So even though they were really concerned with the economy, at this time, with government starting to change, economic priorities start to change. So things go from social safety net to no social safety net. And we see that creates sort of a problem in supporting Brazilians. But we also see that Brazilians were starting to get annoyed with this. There were guerrilla fighters, there were student protesters. And these student protesters were children of Congress people and military officers. These weren't regular Joe Schmoes. These were people whose parents had big influence, so to speak. When Congress refused to expel 2 members that spoke badly of the president, that's when President Silva's power also began to be weakened. Because with all of this censorship going into play, the president thought he could also weaken that of his Congress even more than had already been done by the military coup. And that just wasn't the case. This was actually a strong example of the military getting pushed back a little bit. Later into his presidency, he suffered a stroke, and the next issue began when the military did not want the vice president to succeed him, nor did they want anyone down the line of succession to take office. They weren't military approved. So essentially, they came up with a military council of 3 that would lead while the president was incapacitated. And that takes us right into chapter 5, and that looks at the presidency of President Medici starting in 1969. This chapter discusses the continuing economic stances under his administration, a greater emphasis on a military government, with the president coming from the military, but for only 1 term. So we see here that presidents have short tenures. They weren't people that had long 8 years, 12 years. They were short presidencies. And the military did this on purpose. While they wanted to rule, they didn't want someone like the leaders in Spain who would rule for decades. They didn't want one man to control everything. Government interference in creating elections and protest by blank ballots. So what we see here also is that when there were elections, while the arena party, the party of the military, would win, people were starting to go against them by voting for nobody. They would put in blank ballots, and that was the start of the beginning of protests. It also discussed the rising guerrilla movement. It talks about the capturing of ambassadors, starting with the US ambassador, and how they used that to be able to bribe the government to get their information out, even though there was great censorship. And the last thing that this chapter kind of goes into is the US and Brazil relationship. While Nixon was okay with the type of human atrocities that were occurring in Brazil, including torture, some US senators were starting to take big issue with this and were even threatening to freeze US military aid until torture ended. Chapter 6 looks into the presidency of Ernesto Geisel, and we see really quickly that presidencies are just changing hands immediately. His presidency hoped that he could liberalize the government. So it went from a tough military government to one that could hopefully be more liberal. And his goal was to be a president who would rule less on those institutional acts that presidents were putting into play and having more free elections. It did seem like a fairy tale, though, when Fred Morris, an American who had left the church service and lived in Brazil, was arrested and tortured. His detainment was due to the fact that he was believed to be giving favorable information to foreign news about Dom Helder Câmara, a critic of the military. This created tension between the US and Brazil and weakened the president's possibilities of liberalization, since his military had essentially forced his hand by torturing an American. So the military genuinely, as Skidmore points out, didn't like this idea of liberalization. And it is believed by some that they used this torturing of an American to make it harder for him to create a more open, fair, and democratic government. Another difficulty also lied in the government's chances in winning elections. In the direct elections, when they started to happen, the Arena Party did not perform well, and the MDB party, the opposition party to the government, picked up significant gains. On top of that, with the blank ballots being submitted, the government noticed it was in deep trouble if it were to call general elections fully. And while liberalization was the goal, obviously, it was not the end result. Chapter 7, though, really starts to see the clear patterns of the military dictatorship. I've said it a few times now: new president elected, election issues noticed by military officials, economic issues and recovery. New president comes in, tries to fix the economy, it gets good. A president comes in after that, either continues it or messes it up, or something happens in the world that they can't control. And we also see that the protesters and the workers are starting to gain more power. 1979 kind of sees this revolution within the protesters, with people such as Lula, who would later one day become a president, protesting against that dictatorship. They were arguing for collective bargaining, which they got. And the government also allowed for multiple political parties and for people once banned to run from office to be able to run. Now, the government's idea behind this was in hope to still be able to contain power. They were hoping that if they allowed for multiple parties to run, reinvented their party, and gave some allowances to the protesters, that they would be able to split enough of the opposition and maintain power. But eventually, the opposition was able to gain power and being able to lead governments, one day with people such as Lula leading the Workers' Party being able to be president. The opposition eventually, by banding together, was able to beat the military government. And that's where we get into chapter 8. Chapter 8 talks about Brazil returning as a democracy. It talks about the chaos that ensued while Brazil was trying to rid itself of the military regime. It talks about the inauguration of President-elect Tancredo, the inauguration that never happened because of his health problems. It looks at the government and the issues they were now dealing with, especially when they're under civilian control. I mean, this book talks about how Congress couldn't do anything in their first few months or first few years of civilian control because no one could agree on anything. The New Republic dealt with issues such as Congress not even being able to pass legislation, allowing itself to govern efficiently. It wasn't able to control rampant inflation, and it was trying to figure out how to deal with human rights abuses. Quite frankly, the thing that we can see from all of this now is how far Brazil has come, but also the dangers. We see that the military dictatorship finally ended. But if we look today and we see former President Bolsonaro, who was a former military captain, how far he's gotten supporting the military and what happened all those years ago, supporting the brutality. So we could see a possible return or a slip in democracy if people see what happened all those years ago fondly, instead of they remember it as something tragic. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in the next few years. President Lula won re-election after he was out for a few years, but very barely. And his election caused for the storming of the Congress and caused for people to essentially want a coup in support of Bolsonaro, a man who himself supported the military dictatorship and was a captain in it. So we don't know what's going to happen. But we do know that this book provided a great summary, and my PowerPoint presentation doesn't go into everything that ever happened. It just gives little snippets of all the major things in the chapters, and it encourages people to read the book because it's truly quite fascinating and really allows you to see what was going on in that 21-year time period. Thank you so much.